Thank you for joining us for the session on final outcomes from the recent Sydney Maas trial with project partners IAG, ITLS and iMove. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Yaluk Ut Weelam clan of the Boon Wurrung traditional custodians of the land where we host this event today. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which each of you are living and working from today. We pay our respects to their elders, both past, present, and emerging. We acknowledge and uphold their continuing relationship with these lands. Just to give you a little bit of information about iMove for those who are not familiar with us, we're a national centre for collaborative transport research and development. We are funded by the Australian federal government through the Federal Cooperative Research Centre program, our industry partners and research partners, including IAG and the University of Sydney. If you would like to know more about us and what we do, please feel free to visit our website. It's iMoveAustralia.com. Just a few housekeeping things. During the event, there'll be a no chat for attendees, so that function has been disabled. Please feel free to submit questions at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Questions will be answered after both presentations are finished. And this session is being recorded. Recordings and slides will be available post the event. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Sam Lorimer, a disruptive technologist at IAG. Sam is IAG's research lead for the Sydney Maas service trial and also heads up IAG's cooperative research portfolio. His background is in technology projects and research in the areas of automated vehicles, connected infrastructure, and AI. Over to Sam.
Thank you very much, Leanne. Lovely to see so many people have joined today. I'm just going to quickly share some I think I was muted. Sorry, I hope you can still hear me here. Now, I'll just kick off the few slides to introduce you all to the trial briefly. I know we've gone through before, so I'll try and keep the overview quite brief, but there's some people joining who may not know the structure. And then we'll get on to the outcomes from a Maas broker perspective. So here's my overview for the day, how we set things up, what it was like operating a multimodal subscription service in New South Wales, and then some of the outcomes and commercial considerations from an IAG perspective as the Maas broker, and I'll leave the research outcomes. David will cover off after this. So, objectives and rationale. Why? One of the big questions before I begin that I always am asked is, why on earth is an insurer operating as a business partner in a mobility as a service project? So just to head that off, IAG have done a long history of research into mobility and obviously are really interested in the trends in mobility that see people moving away from a sort of traditional private vehicle, personally insured, and moving to these multimodal aspects, and how that might affect car ownership is a big interest area. But also in terms of mobility as a service, IAG has existing relationships with lots of transport providers that we use to help customers when they are out of their current vehicle due to an accident or other insurable means. So as a Maas operator, using some of those partnerships gave us a bit of a leg up to get this trial moving. So that's super quick overview of why IAG. In terms of this Maas trial, let's just quickly go through what we set out to achieve. I'll summarize this quickly because people may have seen before, but we wanted to see if we could stand up a fully functional Maas service in the Sydney area. And we wanted to see not only could it could it be feasible to do this, but could we make it desirable for customers to take this up and have a willingness to pay their own money to participate in this trial, more akin to customers than just trial participants? And then really thirdly was, could we then influence the way that they use their private vehicles and some of the other car-based modes by bundling and giving incentives for different transport options that we could provide through the Maas service? And obviously key to all of this is documenting and giving, you know, pretty transparent insight into everything that we've found through beautiful webinars such as this, and our final report that I hope everyone will have a read of. And then finally, from an IAG broker perspective, some of our goals going into this, Trippy was the name of the service that we developed for this trial. We had pretty lofty goals of trying to make this a completely integrated platform. We wanted payment functionality to be more or less complete. So we would deal completely in isolation with the transport providers and have a relationship with them. The trial participants, or customers in this case, shouldn't be directly interacting or paying those providers. We would take all the payment from them and have complete freedom to bundle these options as the partners wished for experimental purposes. And we did achieve that. We also kept complete trip records. So we weren't doing any guessing in this trial of was this person walking along there or riding a bike or on a bus along the same route. We had complete log of all trips taken from these providers. And we didn't put any onus on participants to sort of keep logs or receipts. So we have a really accurate snapshot of exactly how people traveled. And we had, for a subset of the participants, about a third had access to a service called NRMA Safer Journeys, which is a crash detection and response service, but it can also, for these people that opted in, provide us information about the car journeys that were taken for participants during that time. So we had a pretty good range of functionality and a really good baseline objective to get a good experiment platform. And the way that we set this up in New South Wales, these are the services that we got on board, most of which IAG had existing relationships with, which really boosted some of the setup. I think for lesser known providers or private operators looking to set this up, it would be substantially more difficult to get a foot in the door and set up these relationships and accounts. But in this case, we had not only the advantage of the existing relationship, but we also were using IAG staff as the customers for the trial. So this really accelerated our ability to offer them services without quite as much risk of doing it for the full general public, but they were consuming these completely in their private capacity, and there was no work-related travel needing to be taken through this service. They could if they wished, but it was intended for them to be paying out of their own pocket, which they did. So we had Uber for ride sharing, Opal for all the public transport services in New South Wales. GoGet is short-term car usage by the hour or by the sort of half day, a full day. Rather than Thrifty being the long-term car rental provider, and CabCharge, an Australian operator which allows payment in all our taxis around the city. And we did some branding. I won't dwell on this, but the Trippy branding, we tried to make this quite fun and playful about getting from A to B for all the participants, and got a lot of good feedback on the, not trying to make this too serious, help them understand how it's going, but have a little bit of fun along the way. We branded all of the cards and all of the GoGet tags with these logos, all the correspondence that went in and out, and tried to make this akin to a commercial service for the participants. And also importantly, our other partners in the trial, SkedGo, did a fantastic job re-skinning and extending their existing TripGo platform, which provided the fundamental route planning element from A to B across services. That's kind of the central picture that you see there. But importantly, we co-designed and added the couple of very important features needed to make this an end-to-end solution. On the left being the ability to choose mobility plans. So we could have participants scrolling through, seeing what sort of a monthly plan was available and what discounts or incentives there might be included in that plan, how much it would cost up front, and ability to opt in and swap between those. And then on the right-hand side, it's a test screenshot, but they had a complete view in their wallet of all trips taken, how much they had spent across all modes, and they could see which payments they'd made as well within there and filter across the three. And out of all of the digital aspects of the trial, that right-hand panel was by far and away the most loved element of the application. It wasn't, you know, the trip planning, people enjoyed that, but they said, we have other options. We know, you know, we can do this a few times. We don't need to do that every trip that we take. But that right hand, seeing your entire travel portfolio in one screen under one pane of glass and know your spend very accurately, was a really key feature that people loved about the trial. This is just another little view of what booking a trip looked like. And some of the payment element, just for those that are interested, the cab charge element was done with a digital cab charge card, so participants could just tap as they got out of any taxi. So we didn't mandate that every trip needed to be set up inside the app in order to capture it. People could just jump in a cab off the street. They would tap this card at the end. We would capture all the information about that trip and broker the payment. Similarly for Uber, setting up a company profile such that people could take their personal travel through here and the payment never touched their accounts. It would all come through us along the way to allow us to do the discounting and get a full view of all trips taken. So with that in mind, with the setup, operationally, we got 100 IAG staff. We had a lot more than that actually apply, but we filtered them down with ITLS based on, you know, geographic spread, as well as getting a good mix between participants that already were quite multimodal travelers and also cohorts of people who were intensely just car focused and didn't believe that this could change their mind, because we wanted to have a nice view across both. And we did quite a extensive onboarding session with each of these people to ensure they knew what was happening throughout the 6 months, and they were completely set up digitally on their personal phone to operate the product and have all the relevant accounts, and they were ready to go on day one. And this is a little view of the plans. I know David will go into more detail around how these were designed, but just so you've got an upfront view, we began everyone on a pay-as-you-go plan, which you can see we didn't charge them, and we let them get a bit of a baseline of how they like to travel if they wished. They could start to get a feel for the app, see all the trips that they'd taken. And then over the course of the trial, we incrementally introduced these other bundles, which were based around analysing the data of the travellers so far, seeing what we could do to incentivise a behaviour we wanted to encourage, and then introducing them. And I'll stop going into more on that because I know David has plenty on there. The way we introduced this operationally as a provider was to give them an estimate of how much this would cost for them. And this one's an example across 90 days for someone that had been on the trial for a while, but we did this even after their first month. We would show, based on their travel patterns, how much each of the plans on offer at that point in time would cost them. And this sort of helped them make an educated decision, because we heard a lot from some of the participants at the beginning who just said, I honestly don't really know how much I spend on travel, especially across modes. They all direct debit my credit card. I don't even look at it a lot of the time, so I'm aware per trip, but people estimating their own travel, they would radically underestimate it in our experience. This is just quickly what the bill would look like at the end of each monthly period. And some of the unexpected things we came up along the way included COVID hitting in March and needing to do some refunds along the way. We had very friendly staff that would give tips to Uber drivers and things. You can see a log from some of our automation that was tracking all those trips, and we had to disaggregate some of the tips from trip costs. And then the car-based modes, there was a lot of additional charges and features there, which we had to take into account often, which got charged significantly after the actual trip itself was taken. So for people looking to start this up as a Maas broker, you actually absorb a lot of the complexity of every operator's underlying business model and how quickly they can provide this information to you. And you need to ensure that your customers paying you for a service understand what the timing of when these different elements will come through. So super quickly, a couple of broker-facing outcomes from me before David goes into the research outcomes. This one quickly I've stolen from Chin at ITLS. It's probably one of my favorites, but just showing the estimated incentive that we were providing to people based on these plans and how carefully they had to be designed, as David will outline, to ensure we weren't giving away hundreds of dollars of potential travel to people. And we had different cohorts that would be attracted to the different offers, but we wanted the savings per month to be sort of around that sort of $20 to $30 mark and not too much more. We've got a pretty good cluster there. And keep that in mind whenever we're talking about commercial outcomes ongoing, that's sort of around the sort of cost incentive that we were giving people to change their behavior. And finally, we saw really good sentiment on this, partly obviously because we were helping some of the participants to save money. I would note not all of them saved as much as those estimates allowed, because that assumed they fully took advantage, and often people would not travel every single day that they had the previous month. But there was a really strong appetite from people saying, if this was released, I would definitely purchase it. Please don't shut it down. However, the big question of economics, which is what David will help cover. From our perspective as an operator, there's big hurdles to overcome here. If you're offering something as a pay-as-you-go service, there's very little incentive for someone to use your product over just tapping their credit card, which is becoming increasingly common, especially among Opal services and most of these other things linked to a credit card. And if you try and charge a customer slightly more for your product to use it in a pay-as-you-go mode in a single app, we saw a lot of outcry from participants, even for a small credit card surcharge that we were initially putting on top of their bill, saying, you know, why on earth would I use this? I can just pay this cheaper. So certainly there doesn't appear to be an appetite to make a margin on a pay-as-you-go style service. You would need to be giving them some incentives, most likely, and recouping that through environmental benefit or societal benefit, or through bundling with other product offerings that you had. And in terms of our bundle outcome from an operator perspective, we certainly see that you could try and negotiate bulk discounts from some of these providers and do it in a standalone way. We, for trial purposes, weren't pushing too hard for discounts, but I do think that will be a challenging negotiation with these providers who themselves wouldn't necessarily see a benefit in people coming through your service versus anybody else's. And similarly, you'd have to have a really high value of this data that you're collecting for your business or for other promotional elements, or a partnership with a public entity like government with specific objectives around reducing congestion or the benefits of the climate, to make that bundle for the sort of $20 a month mark that we had to get a really good take up and people excited about using the product, to make that worthwhile. So I'll lead off there and leave David to share some of the analytical and research outcomes.
Thanks very much, Sam. Thank you for sharing that. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor David Hinscher. David is the founding director of the Institute of Transport and Logistics Studies and has been since 1990 at the University of Sydney. David is an internationally renowned academic and known as a leader in transport research. David has advised numerous government and industry agencies in Australia and globally in the broad areas of transport economics, demand forecasting, economic evaluation, policy planning, and he led the Maas trial in Sydney. It gives me great pleasure to hand over to David.
Thank you, Leanne. Hopefully you can all see my slides. And also I should thank Sam for his great overview, which makes my presentation a lot easier. I just want to acknowledge a really important point before we begin, and that is that this is very much a great partnership between a university, an app developer, and a major private enterprise. And the trust and relationships that were built up, as I will say towards the end, become absolutely essential to the success of Maas. Some of those human elements are critical, and that we often say that the strong focus on the app, as important as it is a necessary but far from sufficient condition for Maas to be a successful offer into the market. I also would like to particularly recognise our colleague who's not talking today, Dr. Chin Ho, who was very much central to this entire project, as were other people that I've listed. So the trial, as Sam said, took place over a number of months, 5 months in the field, but we did a lot of work leading up to that, and we have done a lot of work subsequently. So it's become a 2-year trial because there was so much to learn. And in terms of the objectives, which Sam has already mentioned, but I'm pleased to put a tick next to all of them, is I believe that we set out to achieve these 6 objectives, and indeed we achieved them all. However, the trial still learned a lot about what can always be done better within the context of each of these objectives. There were 4 major components, which Sam has also mentioned, and I will apologise if I'm being slightly repetitive, but I think it's important because it does highlight the key components that you have to think about before you actually get into the field and test various pagey and bundle configurations. Clearly, you need an app developer, as Sam has discussed, and you need some suppliers. And I have to say, just to reinforce what's been said, getting suppliers of transport to participate is actually not a trivial matter. Indeed, the ride-share operator was rather reticent in the beginning, and especially if we were even to consider any other operator such as Didi or Ola. And so there's a lot to be learned about what's in it for the supplier. As a trial, they thought that, well, no harm in being involved because we want to learn as well. Public transport was central, and the car, both the short-term go-get and the longer-term thrifty rental car. There were no issues at all there. We weren't able to get the e-scooter folks at the time. They said they weren't ready to integrate. They may be now, but we weren't able to include them. But we feel that we have at least got the important components, which is the public transport, the ride share, and some elements of rentals of cars under various configurations. Of course, signing up the customers, and as you know, they were all signed up through IAG. I don't see that as a constraint. In fact, it's interesting. It raises questions about the opportunity for Maas to be delivered through an employer rather than through individuals or through groups per se. So that wasn't an issue. And then the big issue, of course, is who will coordinate all of this. And that was the broker or the aggregator, which is IAG. And this becomes a particularly important task, as has already been outlined, in terms of all the negotiations through the supply chain from customer to supplier, to bundle design, to sales, marketing, communications, and feedback and communications is absolutely vital. And that is something that we did particularly well towards the end. And it was essential for people to get an appreciation of the value proposition, which led to a strong interest in continuing had we been able to continue. And finally, the post-trial evaluation, which we spent almost a year on, analysing all the data, not only from the app, but also from the Safer Journeys program on car use, because one of our particular objectives was to see to what extent we could introduce bundles that would actually reduce private car use. In the long term, we would hope would reduce private car ownership, but the trial was too short to be able to comment on that. But if we can reduce car use, that has positive impacts on emissions and congestion. Once again, just to iterate for those who look at the Maas literature, there are a number of levels of Maas in terms of the architecture. We believe we've covered all the levels. And the one that we particularly like to highlight is level 4, which is the integration of societal goals. And we make the very strong point throughout that unless Maas is able to add huge value in achieving societal goals, we would question the value of Maas per se. That may sound controversial, and it might then end up being nothing more than the convenience to users of being able to access an app. But will it actually do anything in terms of achieving broad societal goals, which I think was the cornerstone of Maas in the beginning, as delineated by Maas Global. The sample, there were in the end actively 93 participants. We did lose a few who actually left IAG, and under the rules you had to be an employee to participate. But I do want to make an important point here, that there was a significant number of people that also actively used their private car. So people signing up were not just people that were committed to using more sustainable modes. And that's an important point, because one of the objectives is to see if they can move into the more sustainable modes by the way we offered bundles. And at the bottom on the left, I make a very strong point that although there were only 93 participants, we actually had 4 months of data points prior to COVID hitting, excluding the November period, which was pay-G only. So in a sense, we have 372 data points that we're able to analyze as we went through the monthly introduction of bundles. So I'd like to talk now briefly about bundles, because we believe that they are at the center of Maas and at the center of the trial. And we will go so far as to say that without subscription bundles, we do not think Maas has a real potential to make a difference to the performance of the transport system. pay-G itself is aligned with a multimodal convenience through the app, but it's not likely, as we've seen from what Sam said and I will show you, to really change people's sustainability options in favor of public transport and associated modes. The bundles, once again, I'm just reproducing them here, and I just want to go through them one at a time, because this is a really important and innovative methodology where we introduced one bundle at a time as we learned about market response, noting that we spent up to a month in November introducing people to pay-G to get familiar with the app, to get familiar with the process of participation. And we did not want to cloud that by adding in the bundles, even though that was the subsequent journey. In fact, we didn't even mention that bundles are coming. So let me quickly go through each of them. When we started, just before December, when we introduced a bundle, we did not have as much rich data on people's trip behavior to be able to be confident that we would be sure that we picked the winning bundle. But what we did do, given we had a fixed budget of financial incentives, we asked ourselves, what sort of discount could we possibly offer to possibly make this an attractive bundle for people to consider it. And if you look at the key considerations of the listened here, we had to look at this seasonal effects, less work days, more parties, which translates into less public transport and maybe more Uber taxi trips. And we had limited usage data to guide us, and we wanted to come up with a nifty name, and we eventually settled on a 50% discount, noting that the $200 cap on Opal per month, if indeed you had reached that, which meant you wouldn't pay any more. So we took the $100 cost minus the $50 subscription and came up with a gap of $50. And we called this 50/50. This is a very appealing bundle because we're able to suggest for $50 a month, and once again, we had little knowledge as to how sensitive the subscription price was, we could offer you half fare on public transport and $3 off of every ride. That's a ride to do with Uber and taxi. And at the time, we decided not to offer any discounts on GoGet and Thrifty. We thought in December there would be the party-in month, and that would be attractive to encourage people to use Uber and taxi instead of their private car by offering them a discount. As a result of that, we moved on to the next period, which is January, which became known as Saver 25. And we started to learn more about people's usage, generally speaking, of 50/50 and pay-as-you-go. And some of the key considerations, we wanted to recognize that there were seasonal effects still in place, less work, more flexible non-public transport travel. So discounts on public transport may not have been as attractive, given that people are likely to be using it less, given the vacation period. And we wanted to test a lower entry barrier, remembering that we had little knowledge at the time as to whether $50 was a good number or what. So we thought we'd halve that, and we decided to add in discounts on GoGet on the assumption that during the holiday period, people might wish to access a car, especially if they didn't have one available. So we offered a discount of 15%. And what we were wanting to do, as is always important when you design bundles, and it's detailed in our papers, we wanted to avoid diluting the 50-50 take-up. So we decided not to change the discount up on public transport, but actually to drop it down, on the assumption then that maybe what we're doing here is still supporting public transport users for 50-50, but moving more to the ride share and the car hire in the January Saver 25. It's getting more exciting because as we then move through to the next period, we start to find that looking at the evidence from 50-50 and Saver 25, we're identifying two distinct markets. The 50-50, where we're tending to attract regular public transport users, typically 8 to 10 trips a week in a month, and Saver 25 was attracting users with a lower level of public transport use, maybe 4 to 5 trips per week, and 1 or 2 rideshare trips. So what we decided to do was to focus on the heavy public transport users and to essentially offer them a free public transport use, but to introduce a higher subscription rate. This gave us the opportunity to evaluate quite a wide range of subscription rates. And throughout these 3 bundles, we're in a very strong position to be able to test different discounting strategies in terms of each of the modes. I should mention, although I won't be talking in too much detail, that up the top we have this 4-phase process where we look at the data we've got, we do some analysis, we then suggest some data-driven design to fill in gaps that may not have been well covered from the previous bundles, and then we did some sensitivity testing based on what we've already learned to see what might be driving people's support for bundles in order to arrive at the next monthly bundle. This is extremely innovative because we are incrementally adding in bundles as a result of learning, something that, as far as we're aware, other trials, the few that are reported, did not do. They simply put them all out there in day 1, and we're obviously talking about WIM and Ubigo in Sweden and of course Finland for WIM. We then decided that there was some fine tuning required. We did some quantitative analysis midway through the trial, and we came up with a couple of points that needed modification, and they related to Saver 25. First of all, the GoGet discount virtually had no impact at all. So within the sample we had, this was not a very attractive option. The preferences were much more for regular public transport and rideshare. And so we also found that when we discussed this with people, that they were finding the percentage less attractive to a fixed dollar price. Of course, 15% off every ride was quite a good number for long trips, but not for short trips. And quite a few of the people that were using Uber and taxi were tending to take shorter trips. And so a fixed dollar of $3 was actually quite an attractive offer because it was seen to be financially better. But on top of that, given the interest in first and last mile, we said to ourselves, how can we link Uber and taxi into attracting people to use public transport? So we introduced a $5 addition to the $3 for those who would use Uber to and or from a public transport station, which is sort of interesting because that's part of the new trial that Transport for New South Wales is about to begin, with a $3 off as long as you have traveled on public transport in the most recent 60 minutes. So we introduced that $5 flat fare to see what impact that might have on top of the $3. So we're getting quite generous here with rideshare. What did this mean? The summary results are very encouraging in the sense that we have 57% of the participants on bundles compared with PayG by March 2020. That's after we've introduced 3 and revised 1 of the bundles. This is an extremely encouraging result, which I might say is not unaligned with what people find in stated preference surveys. But what is particularly important, that this was not significantly diluting the previous offered bundles, but actually growing support as we introduce bundles. And you can see from this diagram that the green class saw the most growth. This is the one where you paid $125, the highest subscription fee, but you did not have to pay at all for public transport, hence all you can eat. It's a great phrase that Sam came up with. So what's important is that a high subscription fee does not necessarily detract from wanting to subscribe for a bundle if there is in fact a financial attractive set of discounts on the modes that are being offered. That's a really important result. When we began the trial, we really had no idea whether the subscription price would kill off an interest in a bundle, and that has not turned out to be the case. We've done a lot of statistical analysis, and in the final report, which will be released after this presentation, the whole 250-page report, we did some significant analysis to understand people's choice amongst all the bundles in page E. And this diagram is particularly important as a simulation because what it shows is that the top line of the dark black one, which is page E, suddenly takes a dive as people start to see cost savings on the bundles. That's very pronounced, and that tells us that financial incentives are going to be absolutely essential in order to achieve the take-up of Maas. And as an aside, there is a challenge here because although we know that people believe that service levels improve frequency, reduce crowding, all these sorts of issues are important, they are unlikely to be identified as unique to the Maas product, but offered generally to all services under all circumstances. It is only through financial incentives, as far as we can see at the moment, that we have a way of providing a reward mechanism for the Maas users, unless you want them to earn points to cash in on other activities. But that is very similar, if you like, to financial rewards. Briefly on car use, because this was an important issue, and luckily for us, we were able to access the Safer Journeys program where we were tracking the car use of the respondents. And the most important result from our analysis, which is highlighted in blue here, is that with the mean monthly kilometres of 434, our modelling suggested that a 1% increase in the probability of choosing a bundle is predicted to reduce monthly kilometres from 434 to 367. Now, some of you might say that's not much, but if you scale that up to the population, and this is one of the big challenges with Maas, is it a niche product or a scalable product? Then if it's scalable, that's a significant reduction in car kilometres. So that gives us a nice warm feeling that Maas has the potential, if the bundles are designed appropriately, and that's a very important point. We do not find this as a page E outcome, that this can actually be achieved. Come April, when we were intending to return to page E, as you know, from May 20, COVID hit, and we weren't able to do that because we felt it was important to see to what extent there might be some continuing use of Maas if it only became page E, although our speculation is that we would have lost a lot of the participants who were interested in bundles, 57% of them indeed at the end. So what have we learned through the Sydney trial? Well, I think the most important point is that page E alone is not going to achieve the level 4 sustainability goals, which we would argue are absolutely critical to promoting the success of Maas. And even though page E may add some convenience to users through a more efficient multimodal app, that's all it would do, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not likely to have a big impact on the way our transport system performs, be it niche or scalable. So the first lesson is that bundles are tools that serve a goal. And we would argue that this is not the case with And they need to be clarified, these goals, before the bundles are designed. What we mean by that is, are you designing Maas to make money, a profit focus, or are you designing Maas to achieve sustainable outcomes, or both? This is quite important, and I think we are quite a long way from being able to say with any degree of certainty that there is a commercial outcome any more than there's a business outcome in terms of societal contribution. But I'd like to say more about that because I don't want to be seen to be too negative, because there are some very positives looking forward. The other lesson is that data elicitation and bundle design have to be coordinated well. And the thing that we're very proud of is the well-planned cascade. We didn't initially intend this, but it became clear as we got into the design of the process that a pre-trial survey was essential, an initial pay-as-you-go period was essential, which gave people total familiarity in the process of participating and using the app. And then the sequential bundle design became absolutely essential to make sure that the next bundle was actually going to not dilute the previous one, but add more opportunity in terms of the way in which people would choose to travel and hopefully reduce their car use. And as Sam said, and I think this is also important, monthly feedback is very, very important, and it was quite innovative. People want to know how much are they spending on different modes of transportation, and many of the people had absolutely no idea how much they were spending and also how much time they were traveling. And that led to some reappraisal of their travel options. So the information trail that we were able to share through the trial became an extremely important feature of informing people about the benefits of cascading from payee to bundle, and with rare exception, back to payee. Not going to go through this in any detail, but we will share with you in our report what we regard as the necessary design criteria, designing bundles, and what additional features you need to seriously think about. I should mention as an aside though, pre-COVID compared with today, we think that monthly subscriptions with increased working from home may have to be rethought. If people are only going to travel, say, 3 days a week, they may not be prepared to pay for a bundle which gives them discounts 5 days a week, just as one example. And I think that it doesn't necessarily change the modal mix, but it might change the profile of the pricing. We undertook qualitative interviews, both mid-trial and post-trial, and this is very important, what we call the mixed methods research method, with a lot of interviews with all the respondents in order to get a good understanding as to what it was that really drove their decisions and their continuing support for Maas. And I just want to highlight a couple of points here, and they're highlighted in red, is that 17% of the participants reported that their experience of the trial changed their view of car ownership, and 82% would have purchased the trial offering if it became available after the trial. So that's a really important finding. In other words, the trial had the potential, with the bundles that we selected, to reduce car ownership looking forward through reduced car use initially. I might mention that although I focused on car use up till now, people were telling us that they might rethink their ownership of a private car, be it the second car, not necessarily the first. So that's an important result. But also worth mentioning that under the second point between the two red is that the employers saw this through discussions with their employees, the participants, an opportunity to link this in with their sustainability charters, which are now often called the social license. And this is a really important point, because this means that employers or groups, even groups that are interest groups, may wish to seriously consider a framework in which they support Maas in order to achieve objectives like sustainability charters. Something that we were not looking at initially, but became very clear through the process. And I believe that many organizations are just looking for ways in which they can achieve the social license. And when you talk to a lot of the big organizations, they struggle to know how to do it. I want to make the important point because this has often come up about studying Maas, and there's lots of people out there talking about it. There's lots of people claiming expertise, but our view is, given all the complex intertwining parts of the web of Maas, unless you've actually undertaken a trial or a serious Maas product, I don't think you realize all the many challenges. And they are substantial and they are significant. And they are what we call well beyond the design of an app. Almost done. It is the first trial worldwide with a transparent reported quantitative evidence. We're very proud to say that. Ubigo 1 in Sweden made a strong attempt to do that. They revised it, they introduced Ubigo 2, and sadly it has been stopped. It just didn't work. We believe that we have been able to validate many of the SP surveys with revealed preference data, which is after what a trial is all about. We also believe that we've managed to design a tripartite structure between a broker, an app developer, and a university, and we believe that's a blueprint. And my view is that these things should not be led by app developers, but they have an integral role because they have expertise that's more focused on the technical expertise as distinct from the structural management of the process. And two final points below, which I won't spend too much time on, but happy to talk about in questions, is that we have not yet seen evidence, admittedly it's a niche trial, of a sustainable business model without subsidy. Now, subsidy can come from a couple of sources. One, it can come simply from government linking Maas into its broad strategic goals and seeing some value in providing additional financial support. But our view is if that happens, it may have to go through a tendered process and not a deregulated model. And the other one is a real possibility of not talking about multimodal, but talking about multi-service, whereby we actually have non-transport providers participating, and this could be done through frequent flyer points into shopping support and so on, as another way of providing, if you like, a subsidy into the product. Without government subsidy and or non-transport financial input, to date, we do not see a commercial model, and we doubt there will be a business model. And the business model, in our view, should be one that can tick on its sustainability outcomes. So a multimodal needs to be reformed as multi-service, and we've talked about this in a number of papers. As you see, there's a paper at the bottom called Going Somewhere or Nowhere, and I think the point is that without a broader view of the role of subsidy through government or through the private sector, through the non-transport provider, we think Maas will be struggling. What we can say is that PayG by itself is unlikely to make a difference in terms of sustainable outcomes. And it is sort of disappointing that we are not yet seeing in Australia any focus on bundles. In fact, when you start looking at the global webinars on Maas, there's almost no reference to bundles. It's all about the latest app under PayG. And we don't think that will ride in terms of long-term benefits to the system as a whole. Finally, I've mentioned this before, that customer service, data analysis capability, marketing, sales and billing are absolutely essential to the success of Maas. But also worth mentioning that when you design bundles, be very careful what you offer, because one of the big criticisms of some bundles that we've observed is that people do not want to pay a high subscription price for a bundle that has irrelevant modes built within it. What this means is you need quite a large number of bundles because there will be heterogeneity in people's preferences. Relationship building and trust between mobility providers, customers, digital platform developers and providers, brokers and regulators is going to be the most challenging part of the Maas delivery program. There is still, generally speaking, when you talk to this industry, quite a lot of distrust in working together. And I think that in itself could be the major constraint for successful Maas. Even though through a trial, you can all be good buddies, when it comes to a commercial proposition, that's another question. In our book we wrote on Maas, just to finish, by itself, Maas is not a panacea alone for modern problems of traffic congestion emissions. It needs to address all of the pain points in transport, connecting with such solutions as road pricing reform and incentives to reduce private car ownership. So see it as an input into the broader challenges of making our transport system more efficient, more equitable, and more sustainable. We have offered, and I'm not going to go through this, a definition of what we think Maas is, and we'd like all of those that are researching or implementing Maas from now on to look at this benchmark and see to what extent they are truly doing Maas, or they are doing what we might call emerging Maas. Maas is not a digital version of a travel planner, it's not a flexible transport service, and it's not a single shared transport offering. We have written numerous papers which are freely available, and we have summarized all of this into a major report of 255 pages, which will be released at the conclusion of this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Sam. We're now going to move on to questions that are coming through. Okay, so this is from an anonymous attendee. Who should pay for financial incentives? David and Sam, I'm going to throw that to either one of you to pick up.
I'll briefly comment on my last comment was with the financial incentives. If we cannot get the suppliers through scalability opportunities to contribute discounts on the transport modes, which is something that we're not seeing at this stage, then it will have to either come from government or from a non-transport source. That's the multi-service idea.
Thank you, David. Sam?
No, completely agree. Nothing further to add to David's response.
Next question. It would be interesting to see the spatial popularity between different options. Example, is the Saver 25 more popular with people who live in the city and walk a lot, with the 125 free public transport more popular for people in the middle ring? So is there a spatial orientation to uptake of the bundles?
The answer is because it's a small sample, there is some amount of that, but it's not strong. It does come down to the availability of the modes in the supply network. And we know that closer to the central business district, the options are more widely available. But having said that, I think it's fair to say, although I need to revert in response later to my colleague Chin Ho, that there was a good representation of choices across all the modes throughout the metropolitan area. But long trips by rideshare are clearly expensive and not that attractive.
Thank you, David. Sam, did you want to add any commentary?
The only addition to that I'd say is from memory, I think their distance that they lived from their nearest public transport hub had a much stronger effect than rings geographically. So even someone further out that lived nearer to a train station, I think, was more likely to take up a certain plan rather than it being segmented geographically.
Next question, is the reduction in car kilometers for private cars or for all cars? Example, are taxis and ride shares included in the reduction of car kilometers?
Those car kilometers are private cars.
Private, okay. If the goals of Maas are societal, are you suggesting taxpayers should fund the bundles?
A very good question. We must be careful how we answer that, because if there is to be some sustainable value in a benefit cost sense, then the additional subsidy should have some sort of efficiency criteria that means that is the best use of those dollars which come from the taxpayer. No different if you ask me about how we fund public transport at the moment. So putting aside the multi-service solution, the point is, if government is going to see some value, and I think there's a disconnect at the moment between broad strategic goals and what Maas stands for in the government sector, if they start connecting that and want to support it, they'll have to put some extra subsidy in, but they'll have to be careful how they do it. And my view is that we can't have stacks of Maas organizations queuing up for a handout. It's got to be done much more carefully and selectively in terms of a benefit to society.
Thanks, David. When assessing the VKT, which are vehicle kilometers traveled between pay-as-you-go and bundles, is taxi or Uber kilometers taken into account?
Well, yes, they're in there, but the kilometers reduction I'm talking about is focused solely on getting people out of their private cars. But we certainly, through the calculation of the cost savings or the cost outlays and the time, it's all the modes that we are studying are built into both the pay-G calculation and the bundle calculation. So they're on the level playing field in that sense.
Thanks, David. Were people more adventurous in their travel choices? For example, did they try out different modes, especially business/rideshare, or travel different routes than before?
I can't really comment on the routes, but in terms of the modes, they absolutely did. There were people in and out of rideshare and in and out of taxi, but you have to, I'd like to qualify it because you're dealing with seasonal effects as well. You're dealing with bundles that are offered in December, January, February, March, and they are different times of the year where the switching between the modes is more a function of what they're doing rather than something specific about the mode. There's nothing wrong with that, and that raises really important questions about how bundles need to be configured to support the variations over months in terms of people's requirements.
I'm going to consolidate a few questions around active transport. There's the next question that's come up. It says, did you see any evidence that well-delivered Maas would reduce the amount of walking? And in that, we can include cycling and more broadly, the impact of successful Maas on active transport.
You want to have a go, Sam, on that?
It's great. I absolutely love that question. Unfortunately, we weren't tracking people's walking, so I can't speak to the data of how often they were walking or cycling beforehand. But anecdotally, on some of the plans we delivered, which gave quite generous discounts on rideshare, for example, we definitely saw people use that a lot more to sort of extract them as much benefit as they could. And we went back and redesigned it to be slightly less generous, as David outlined. And I strongly believe if you design the bundles and incentives wrong, you would definitely see a reduction in active modes because people would be more likely to say, I can get my $3 Uber to the train, you know, it's slightly drizzly outside, why would I walk? Rather than they'd probably just jump on their bike at other times. So yeah, I think that's a really good consideration, actually, which wasn't really part of our trial, but definitely a great one to keep in mind.
I'd just like to very quickly add to that, because I think one of the things that would be ideal, and we only achieved it to some extent through Safer Journeys, is to track all their trip activity. So we knew what was happening outside of the app, outside of Safer Journeys. And one interesting piece of evidence was that even with a heavy discount on Uber, they were still finding that Ola was offering a cheaper deal. And so some people were choosing to go outside of the trial to choose a rideshare that was less expensive. How do we get those ones in? Maybe never, but at least we need to understand the full story if you're to understand if Maas is really achieving good, sustainable outcomes.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the participants, the attendees, and the panel members. There are a huge number of questions coming in as we're going through them. We will respond post the session online. As David mentioned, the final report from the Maas trial is going live as we speak. To get a copy of it, please go to the iMove homepage at iMoveAustralia.com and click on the relevant article and you'll be able to download it. The recording of the webinar will be available on the iMove website shortly, and we'll send a notification to all registered attendees when it's up. We will be running regular project outcomes webinars over coming months, and extend an invitation to all of you to look out for them and jump on when they are advertised. Thank you very much for joining us. We welcome your feedback and ideas for future webinars. If you're interested to hear more about the research outcomes from iMove, please jump on the website. I'm Leanne Breger, I'm the Programs Director for iMove, and thank you very much for participating. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.